The morning light was sharp and unforgiving, slicing through the vast glass windows of Alexander Grant's mansion. It glinted off polished marble floors and the cold gold of picture frames, illuminating a home built to showcase success. But in the grand, state-of-the-art kitchen, a scene was unfolding that no amount of wealth could ever sanitize. Alexander, a millionaire businessman whose life was a fortress of power and control, stepped into the room and froze. The sound of his leather briefcase hitting the floor echoed in the sudden, terrible silence. There, on the pristine tiles, his little daughter, Sophie, sat hunched over the dog's bowl. She was no more than 7. With small, trembling hands, she was scooping handfuls of dry kibble into her mouth, her quiet sobs leaving clean streaks down her dusty cheeks. The sight was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and leaving him shaking. In that single, horrifying moment, a truth crashed over him with the force of a tidal wave. Money could build empires, but it had utterly failed to build a home for his own child. His first thought was a desperate, grasping denial. This had to be a game, a strange and childish prank. But the raw, aching sound of her cries and the desperate way she clutched the bowl told a story he could no longer ignore. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the cold floor beside her. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice cracking. She recoiled, pulling the bowl closer as if he were a thief coming to steal her only treasure. And that was when the carefully constructed world he had built around himself shattered completely. The problem wasn't with her. The problem was with him. The empire he had spent his entire life building had cast such a long shadow that it had blotted out the light in his own house, leaving his daughter to starve in the darkness. Alexander Grant had clawed his way to the top from nothing. He came from a background of worn-out shoes and empty cupboards, and he had sworn an oath to himself that his family would never know the sting of poverty he had endured. His company was a global giant. His name was a headline in financial magazines. He lived in a house that was the envy of everyone he knew. But that relentless climb had a steep price. The endless board meetings, the red-eye flights across continents, and the constant ringing of his phone had turned him into a ghost in his daughter's life. He had justified it all, telling himself it was for her. He was building a legacy, a fortress of security she would one day thank him for. But as he watched his daughter eat dog food out of a loneliness so profound it mimicked hunger, his heart broke into a million pieces. Slowly, painfully, the whole truth began to surface as he sat there with her on the kitchen floor. Sophie's mother had passed away from a sudden illness years ago, leaving Alexander as her sole parent. Instead of stepping into the role of a father, he had thrown himself into his work, using it as a shield against his own grief. He surrounded Sophie with the best of everything: nannies who were paid to care, tutors who were paid to teach, and a mountain of luxury toys that were meant to fill the void. He had honestly believed he was giving her everything a child could ever want. But children don't need marble floors to feel grounded or gold-plated toys to feel loved. They need attention. They need presence. They need the simple, unwavering comfort of knowing that they are the most important thing in their parents' world. Sophie's sobs were not just from an empty stomach. They were the sound of crushing neglect, the silent scream of a little girl who felt invisible. The giant house was not a home, it was a cold, empty museum. The expensive gifts filled her shelves but never touched the emptiness in her heart. Her father was a powerful man to the world, but to her, he was just an absence, a silhouette who was gone even when he was sitting in the same room. She had started sneaking food from the dog's bowl because the kitchen, with its full pantries and gleaming appliances, felt like a forbidden territory. She had been too afraid to ask for a snack, too accustomed to the silence of the house, too convinced of her own insignificance in a world filled with his glittering distractions. Haunted by this devastating realization, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He canceled his meetings, he shut off his phone, he made a vow, right there on the cold kitchen floor, that would fundamentally change the rest of their lives. The empire could crumble for all he cared. The boardrooms could find another king, but his daughter, his Sophie, could not survive without a father. With hands that were more used to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, he gently cleaned her tear-stained face. He took the dog bowl from her, threw it away, and for the very first time in her life, he cooked her breakfast. It was a clumsy disaster. The eggs were slightly burned and the toast was too dark, but as Sophie ate, she gave him a small, watery smile. That single, fragile smile ignited something inside him more powerful than any business deal he had ever closed. The days that followed were a painful, awkward climb. Sophie was wary of his sudden presence. She had been raised by a revolving door of staff and was suspicious of this new, attentive version of her father. Years of neglect couldn't be healed overnight with a plate of pancakes or a single bedtime story. But Alexander was relentless. He wasn't driven by the iron will of a CEO anymore, but by the desperate, humbling love of a father, terrified of losing his child for good. He walked her to school each morning, holding her small hand. He sat and listened, truly listened, to her rambling stories about her day. In the evenings, he put away his laptop and sat with her, learning the names of her dolls and the rules of her imaginary games. He even learned how to braid her hair, his large, awkward fingers fumbling with the strands until his clumsy efforts made her laugh a real, genuine laugh. Slowly, carefully, the walls around Sophie's little heart began to come down. Trust returned, one tiny piece at a time. Alexander also had to face the man he had become. For years, he'd worn his success like a suit of armor, hiding his guilt behind the excuse of providing for his family. But he finally admitted the truth to himself. His daughter didn't need a millionaire. She just needed a dad. He began to change his life from the outside in. He started donating large parts of his fortune to orphanages and children's charities, realizing with a sickening jolt how many children lived with Sophie's pain but without the hollow comfort of wealth. His conversations shifted from profits to people, from market expansion to empathy. Seasons changed, and the Grant mansion began to feel less like a mansion and more like a home. The echoing emptiness was replaced by the sound of laughter. Sophie and Alexander started cooking together, their cooking sessions often ending with more flour on them than in the bowl. They planted a garden, and Alexander learned that watching a flower bloom with his daughter was infinitely more satisfying than watching his stock portfolio grow. He discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the simple, trusting moments when Sophie would reach out and take his hand, no longer afraid, no longer hesitant, just certain that he would be there. The memory of that morning in the kitchen never left him. In a quiet drawer, he kept the dog's old chipped bowl. He would look at it sometimes, not with horror anymore, but with a strange sense of gratitude. It was the symbol of his failure, but it was also the catalyst for his salvation. It was the moment his pride had been shattered, forcing him to see the world not through the eyes of a businessman, but through the tear-filled eyes of his lonely child. By the time Sophie turned 10, the quiet, withdrawn girl was gone. In her place was a lively, confident child whose eyes shone with a light that no amount of money could ever buy. And Alexander, once a man known for his ruthless business acumen, became known for something far greater, his humanity. He had built an empire, lost himself in it, and found his soul again on a cold kitchen floor, in the heartbreaking image of his daughter trying to soothe her aching heart with a bowl of dog food. The truth had broken him, but in breaking him, it had rebuilt him into the one thing he was always meant to be, a father.